If you travel west from Seattle, Washington, and you make your way out onto the Olympic Peninsula, you eventually will come to a large lake. That lake is Lake Crescent. And if you go to any of the public beaches, or if you're talking with any of the locals, you may discover that the waters of the lake are very cold, and you should swim at your own risk. If you think, oh, well, I'll just wade in and get used to the water, and then once I'm warm, I'll sort of dunk in and have a lovely swim. Because Lake Crescent is a very large lake, and it's a natural lake, not a dammed lake. So it's 12 miles long, and it's over 600 feet deep in places. So unlike shallow lakes that get warmed by the sun, especially in the summer months, the waters of Lake Crescent are always icy. And so if you decide to wade in to maybe brave a dip, you'll find as you wade in that your teeth will begin to chatter. And soon you'll begin to shiver. And then as you get out, you'll eventually decide, oh, I'm just going to dunk myself and swim. And you'll do that. There will be this, and then before you know it, you'll be making your way towards shore. And as you do that, you'll feel the icy water on your legs, like icy fingers grabbing at your ankles. Because what the lake gets, the lake keeps. Through the decades, there have been, many, many stories of vanishing things. For example, when they were building the highway that goes along the edge of the lake, this was maybe almost a century ago, they were blasting rock. And on one particular blast, it scared a whole team of horses. And these horses bolted into the water and completely disappeared, just vanished. Hide nor hair of the horses never seen again. And through the decades, there have been many, many people, good swimmers, who have decided to maybe go for a swim at dusk. Or maybe they've decided to go out on a solo canoe. And they're out there and they never come back. And their bodies are never found. What the lake gets, the lake keeps, with one notable exception. It was in the morning, a July morning, 1940. There were two men that were out in a rowboat. They were fishing. And they saw floating on the surface of the lake a large bundle. And from a distance, they could see the bundle was mostly dark, but there were two areas of the bundle that were very, very white. Well, they rowed over toward the bundle, and as they got closer, they could see that one of those areas of whiteness were actually two human hands. And the other area that was white was part of a human face that was exposed but had been eaten away in the water. A corpse. It was a horrible find. Well, they tied a line around that horrible bundle and they towed it to shore and they called the sheriff. And when Sheriff Kemp showed up, he was a rather pragmatic man and he looked at the bundle. Now, this corpse had been wrapped in a blanket. And then around the outside of the blanket, there were several coils of rope. And then the ends of the rope were broken, frayed. And so the sheriff assessed that this corpse had obviously been tied to something very heavy and then thrown into the lake. But when that had happened, he had no idea. Well, he got the corpse to the morgue, and then the coroner took over. And the coroner carefully cut away at that blanket and the rope. And what he discovered was the body of a woman. Now, this woman, her hands and her legs had been tied together. And she had auburn hair. Her face was well preserved with the exception of that part that had been exposed, and that was not discernible. But she was wearing a green wool dress. She was large bosomed. She was wearing an underwire bra. She had a very narrow waist. She had a dark belt around her small waist, ample hips. And on her two legs, she had silk stockings that were pulled up over her knee and held in place by garters. And she had two black shoes on. And the coroner could tell, looking at her neck, there was bruising there. So obviously she had been strangled before she had been thrown into the lake. But how long she had been in the lake, who could tell? But what made this corpse all the more macabre was that this was not a bloated corpse that had been in the water for a long, long, long time. No, no, no. This corpse was almost perfectly preserved, with the exception of the missing part of the face and the fingertips that had been exposed. But it was utterly, completely white like snow. And the Sheriff Kemp, looked at the coroner. He said, "What is going on here? I've never seen anything like this." And the coroner explained that the body must have been in the lake at depth for a long, long time. And deep down in those cold, cold waters, that the lipids, the fats in the woman's tissues had reacted to that cold water. And so over time, it had gone through this transformation that's called saponification. She had actually transformed into a soapy-like substance. And when a corpse goes through that, it becomes lighter. So she had become buoyant. So when the ropes had broken, she floated up to the surface. The sheriff would later say that she looked as though she had been carved out of marble. But who was she? Now, her jaw was stuck closed. So they worked at the jaw and they worked at the jaw, and eventually they broke it open. And on the roof of her mouth, they saw gold. There was a gold dental plate. And so the coroner carefully worked that out of her mouth, and they looked at this dental plate that held several teeth, which gave this woman a complete smile. Now, as we all know, a dental plate is made for an individual. And so even though they couldn't make out her face and they couldn't get any fingerprints, this dental plate, this was a clue. And so the sheriff went around to all the dentists in the area, showed them the dental plate, and they took it. They admired the work, and then they handed it back and they said, "No, I didn't do that." And meanwhile, the word got out to the people on the Olympic Peninsula about this corpse of a woman that had been found in Lake Crescent, that she had turned to soap, that she was utterly, completely white, and she didn't have a name. Nobody knew who she was. And so she became known as the Lady of the Lake. And the people, they looked at one another. They knew that she had been strangled. Who strangled her? Was there a murderer among us? And this was during a time when there were lots of logging camps and fishing camps, and were all seasonal. Lots of people, men and women, coming and going, coming and going. There had been no report of any missing woman. The sheriff didn't really know what to do, but he had that dental plate. So he ended up making up a flyer. And on the flyer, it said $100 reward. It had a drawing of that dental plate. And then it asked, "Did you make this? And if so, do you know the name of the woman who you made it for?" And it had the sheriff's contact information. And he sent that flyer out to dentists all on the West Coast of the United States. And then he waited. 1 month went by. 2 months, 3 months, nothing. 4, 5, 6. The trail was cold. And sometimes Sheriff Kemp, he would go out to Lake Crescent. He would just try to imagine, what that was like. That corpse was down in the lake, and there are people recreating on the surface above. Did they have any idea? And he would whisper out over the lake, Who did this? Can't you tell me? But the lake revealed nothing. 8 months passed, 9, 10, 11, 12 months, a whole year. No word, nothing from the flyer. And then some more time passed, but there was one day when the sheriff's phone rang. When he picked up the phone, it was a Dr. Albert J. McDowell. He was a dentist. He was calling from South Dakota. He said, I got the flyer. Yeah, I made that dental plate. I made it back in 1926. I made it for a Haley Latham Spraker. Oh, a name. Sheriff had a name. So he started searching the area for a Haley Latham Spraker. There was no such person. But there was a Haley Illingworth. Haley Illingworth. She had been a waitress at a tavern on Lake Crescent. Illingworth was her latest married name because she'd married a man named Monty Illingworth, who happened to be a beer truck delivery driver who delivered to that tavern. The two of them were known to have a very volatile relationship. They often abused one another. Alcohol was often involved. And Haley, she had dark auburn hair. She had an ample bosom, small waist, big hips. And she had unexpectedly left the area in 1936, just before Christmas. Monty had told all of her friends that she had had it with his philandering, that she'd taken up with a sea captain. She'd headed up to Alaska. And in time, Monty took up with another woman and left the area too. But it didn't take long to discover that there was no record of Haley ever going to Alaska. So they tracked down Monty, who happened to be down in Long Beach, California. And after an interrogation where his story just didn't add up, he was tried for murder in the first degree. Now, the trial, which took place in Port Angeles, Washington, was sensational, with one witness after another stepping up for the prosecution. People saying things like, yeah, I remember selling Haley that green wool dress. Or someone holding a sample of rope in their hand as they sat in the witness box and saying, oh, yeah, I remember I gave some of this rope to Monty. And it so happened that the sample of rope matched the rope that had been tied around the corpse. And then, of course, there was the dental plate. Unmistakably, that was Haley. And the trial, it wrapped up with Monty being in the witness stand and him crying out to the jury, I didn't kill her. I didn't kill her. But he did not convince the jury of his peers, because Monty Illingworth was found guilty of manslaughter in the second degree, and he was sentenced to life in prison. And Haley's family, they were able to collect the daughter, their beautiful daughter's body, and take it down to Vancouver, Washington, where they buried it in what is said to be an unmarked grave. And then time passed. And all the details of the trial, they all just sort of fell away. But what did stay with people was that image of the corpse of the woman that was floating on the surface of Lake Crescent, that she was perfectly preserved, that she'd been turned to soap. And this became the story that people told as they sat around their campfires. Kids made up rhymes about it. One rhyme that I remember from when I was a kid was, get her in a boat, tie her up with rope, throw her in the water, she turns to soap. Now, there are some people who say that the lake knew that Haley Illingworth deserved justice, and thus it gave up her body. But there are others who say, no, what the lake gets, the lake keeps. And as a result, the lake feels as though it's perhaps one body short. So if you find yourself on the edge of Lake Crescent and thinking about going for a swim, just know that the waters of the lake are very cold and you should swim at your own risk.